Hi friends, let's quickly go over some of the materials that we're going to need. For this project, we're going to need a wooden dowel, of course. You will also need rope and jute. The orange rope I'm using, I purchased off of Amazon. I'll leave the link in the description box for you. Now for the white rope, I'm using 3-strand and I'm pulling it apart, but you can use the same brand as the orange rope if you like. You will also need some sharp scissors, some T-pins, and a mat. Okay, let's get started. On your wooden dowel, we're going to attach all 32 cords using a lark's head knot. Now remember, with my 3-strand rope, I pulled it all apart so that I got 3 separate strands of cord. You don't have to do that, but I kind of like the texture it gives, and it's what I had on hand. Okay, so to make a lark's head knot, you want to fold your cord in half, and then with the loop end, you want to place that behind your wooden dowel, and then thread your long tail ends through that loop. And there you have it. Now to attach the rest. Now this is a very beginner friendly macrame pattern because we only have to know 3 different types of knots. The lark's head knot, which we just did, a square knot, and a berry knot. Let me show you how to tie a square knot. Taking 4 strands of rope, you want to make a loop on your leftmost cord. Then with your rightmost cord, you want to place that behind the 2 center cords and then up through the loop of your left. Cinch that up to the top. This is half of your square knot. So to complete the other half, you want to do the same thing but to the opposite side. So make a loop on your right. Then with your leftmost cord, bring it behind the 2 center cords and up through the loop on your right. Cinch up your slack. And that is how you tie a square knot. Now, if I'm going too fast for you, you can always adjust the speed of this video by tapping the 3 dots on the top right corner. I do suggest practicing and familiarizing yourself with your knots first before attempting any of my patterns. However, this is such a beginner-friendly project that I think you could manage. Okay, so we're going to continue tying square knots all the way across this first row here. And then I'll show you how to alternate if you're not familiar with that term. Now that you completed your first row, what we're going to do is we're going to alternate our square knots. So to alternate your square knots, what we're going to do for every other row is we're going to leave out the first 2 and the last 2 cords. Okay, so skipping the first 2 cords, we're going to tie another square knot. This knot will connect our first 2 knots in the previous row together. Okay, so tie your square knot just the same way we did in the previous row. So alternating your square knots is really just staggering them over a little bit. That way it connects them all together. It forms almost like a lattice pattern. All right, so to tie the next knot, it is the same thing. We're going to tie the next 4 cords together, which join the 2nd and 3rd knot from the previous row together. I apologize if my voice sounds a little bit different. Right now I'm battling a cold. My kids are finally back in school after summer break, and of course they bring home all the germs. But I'm doing much better than I was before. A couple days ago I had a fever. Okay, so for our second row, we're going to go straight across. And when we get to the end, we're going to leave out the last 2 cords because we're alternating. Okay, so for the third row, we can bring back those 2 cords that we skipped. And we're going to continue tying our square knots. But this time, we're going to tie with the very first 4 cords, just like we did in the first row. So when any pattern requires you to do alternating square knots, you're only leaving out the first 2 and the last 2 cords on every other row that they want you to alternate. And don't worry if you see a gap here. That is because we left out the first 2 cords. That is totally normal. Every other row is going to have a little bit of a gap there, and that is totally fine. Okay, so I skipped ahead. We're going to count that we have 5 rows in total. Okay, so we're always going to be alternating. So for our 6th row, we're going to leave out the first 2 cords and then tie 6 square knots all the way across until we get to roughly about the center-ish, and we're going to tie our very first berry knot. Okay, so to tie a berry knot, we're going to need the 4 cords that we normally would have used to tie our square knot, and we're also going to need a strand of jute. You want to fold your jute in half to find the center, then place the center behind your 4 cords. And now what we're going to do is we're going to tie a square knot around the 4 center cords using our jute. Now I find jute is a little bit tricky to work with because well, first of all, it's rough on your hands and it's kind of more wiry than regular cotton rope. If you're uncomfortable working with jute, you can substitute it by using cotton rope in a brown shade. Okay, now that we tied our first square knot, we need to tie 2 more, and it's important that you don't tie it too tight because we want to be able to slide these knots up and down on our white cords. You will see why that's important in just a moment. Despite jute being rough on the hands and a little difficult to work with, I really do like the texture of it, especially for this pumpkin wall hanging. And to be fair, we're not really using a lot of jute in this project, it's just for the stem of the pumpkin. Okay, so double check that you have 3 square knots. 1, 2, 3. So now what we're going to do is we're going to fold it onto itself. So take all 4 of the white strands, and you want to thread that right through the top, right in the center here. Don't pull it all the way through just yet, because what we're going to do is we're going to slide our knots all the way up to the top. And that is why you wanted to make sure that you didn't tie your square knots too tight so that we can slide it up and down. Once you have it up to the top, now you can go ahead and pull the rest of the slack. And as you can see, it curls onto itself. Now to prevent it from unraveling, what you want to do is tie another square knot right at the base. And this one, I do like to make sure that it's very taut and tucked right underneath. And that is it. That is how you tie a berry knot. It's really just a series of square knots folded onto itself and then secured by another square knot. Okay, so to complete your row, you need to tie 8 more square knots all the way across. And of course, we're alternating, so you will be leaving out the last 2 cords on this row. And as far as your berry knots go, don't worry about those loose ends. As you're working, just make sure you tuck it behind your work so they don't get in the way. We will deal with them at the end of this project. Okay, so for row 7, we're going to do 6 square knots, 2 berry knots, and then 8 square knots. And don't forget, we're always going to be alternating all the way down this pattern. And I hope you forgive me, I'm going to do a little less talking during the rest of this tutorial, just to give my voice a little bit of a break. For each row, I'll have the instructions on the top left corner for you, and I will stop here and there just to kind of describe certain situations that you might need a hand with. And speaking of which, this happens to be a moment right now. So now we have to tie 2 berry knots, and it looks a little bit different because of the berry knot in the previous row. You will need to split that berry knot in half because we tied our jute around 4 cords. So anytime you have to tie a square knot or a berry knot underneath a previous one, you will have to split those cords in half. Hopefully that makes sense. Please leave me a comment below if you're a little bit confused, and I will try my best to describe it better for you. When you're tying your second berry knot in this row, make sure you're grabbing 2 cords from your previous berry knot and 2 cords from your square knot next to it. And don't be afraid to tuck in all those loose ends underneath your work. Okay, once your second berry knot is tied, now we just do 8 more square knots all the way across to finish off this row. Okay, so row 8 is similar to row 7. We need to do 6 square knots, 2 berry knots, and then another 7 square knots. Okay, so this row is a little bit involved. What we need to do is 3 square knots, then 3 berry knots in orange, followed by 1 regular square knot, and then 2 berry knots in jute, and then 1 regular square knot, and then 3 berry knots in orange, and then 3 square knots. I know that sounds very intense, but don't panic. It is the same thing that we've been doing. It's just a lot more berry knots and we're adding a new color. Okay, so moving on to row 10, it is also a little intense, just like the previous row, but don't worry, as the pattern moves forward, it will get a little bit less complicated and you will see the pattern really starting to form. This is our last row working with jute, and you'll find that the next few rows will start getting more symmetrical, which will make a lot more sense as you're working through it. Okay, now I'll do less talking because I feel like my voice is starting to go. If you have any cold and flu advice, please leave it in the comments below because I really want to kick this. I'm so done with being sick. So far, I've been taking a lot of echinacea and vitamin C, and then other than that, it's been cold and flu medicine and a lot of rest. Anyways, I'll leave the timestamps of each row in the very first pinned comment of this video. That way, if you need to reference it, you can always go ahead and check out the pinned comment. Okay, so this row is a bit of a break. We're just going straight across, tying just regular square knots all the way across to the end. So the reason why we have a little bit of this break row, is what I'm going to call it, is because what we're going to do is we're going to elongate our pumpkin. When we tied row 13, that was the widest our pumpkin is going to get. So if we started decreasing right now, our pumpkin image would end up looking a little short or squashed looking. So we need a break in this row, which will help elongate our pumpkin. Okay, so for row 15, what we're going to do is repeat the same pattern as row 13, which was our widest our pumpkin was going to get. And I know what you're thinking. You're probably worried that we might have a little bit of a gap because of our break row, but because our berry knots are round, it fills in around those square knots, so it doesn't look like there's a gap at all. It's one of those things where you just have to trust the process. Okay, so for row 16, it is another break row where we're going straight across in just regular alternating square knots. Okay, so for row 17, it is another repeat of row 13. Okay, so now we're at the point where we're going to start decreasing our pumpkin. It happens really quickly, and what it's going to do is just taper off to the base of our pumpkin. Alright, so for row 21 to 23, we're just going to do another set of just regular alternating square knots just to finish off the bottom. Okay, it is already looking super fantastic, but we're not finished yet. What we need to do is flip it over and clean up the mess on the back. Technically, you can leave it as it is, but I do like to tidy up the back. And to do this, all I'm doing is just snipping off the excess rope, leaving about an inch of a tail. Now, if you wanted to be extra fancy, you could add a backing to it, but I think it's fine just as it is. Next, I like to hang it up on the wall and use masking tape to cut the fringe. I find it gives me a straighter edge and it's easier to clean up. If you make this pattern, please tag me on Instagram. I would seriously love to see it. Thank you so much for spending time with me, and I'll see you in the next one.